Welcome to Unfighting in Thailand, the best news and analysis covering the economics and infrastructure of Muay Thai. I'm Matt Lucas, journalist, commentator, and ex-Muay Thai fighter. Make stronger fighters, make stronger people. Today we will be talking to Mark Castagnini, Mark the Hammer, as part of our series on Australian Muay Thai history. As always, if you'd like to reach me, you can follow me on Instagram, MattLucasMuayThai, or email me at a.matt.lucas@gmail.com. Thanks to all the people that have supported me so far, sharing the podcast, leaving reviews, etc. If you'd like to leave a review, that would be super helpful. You can do so in the iTunes store. After years of hard work, studying, and being in the game, I published a Muay Thai encyclopedia on fighting in Thailand, a guide to the sport in the motherland. It's been about a year, but it still holds true. The clear guide goes over scoring, matchmaking, picking gyms, fight styles, gambling, and much more. It also has a series of interviews with long-term expat fighters, including Michael Savas, Willie Whipple, Angela Chang, Lisa Brealey, and others. The country is going to open back up. Shows have started already, so things are really going to develop. And if you are a foreign fighter or you're interested in the sport in Thailand, you should read this book. You can get it off of Amazon as an ebook or a print copy. Again, that's on Fighting in Thailand, a guide to the sport in the motherland. And thanks as always to my sponsors, Muay Legends, for their continued support of the show. They create some great Muay Thai apparel with portions of the proceeds going back to the legends they celebrate. All the superstars have been paid for their images as well. You can check out their gear at www.nakmoylegends.com. Use OnFighting to get 15% off your order. Thanks as always to Patrick Rivera for helping me get this show started. I'm really excited for how long it's been going and some of the great content that I've produced so far. So a little bit on our guest today. Mark the Hammer Castagnini has done it all in this sport. He's commentated, he's fought, he's owned gyms, he's helped out with shows, he's done promotions, he's basically done it all. And we'll go over that from his early fight days to his time with Blitz, an international kickboxer, some of his commentating gigs, his gym histories, and more. So definitely stay tuned in. He's a wealth of knowledge and has a real strong perspective about how Muay Thai is in the world. So without further ado, the interview with Mr. Mark Castagnini. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate you taking your time out. How are you doing?
Good, man. Thank you for asking and for showing interest. I appreciate it. And good to be talking to you.
Yeah, so let's get started right away. You began your Muay Thai career out of karate, actually. You were doing Kyokushin karate for a while. You hurt your knuckle, and then you segued into Muay Thai. What was Muay Thai like when you first started?
Well, look, to be honest with you, it was somewhat unknown back in the early days. My segue from Kyokushin karate to the Bob Jones Corporation, I basically just entered a tournament and placed well. I've never fought Muay Thai. I just had a Kyokushin background. My leg kicks and knees and so forth got me through. So I got invited to train with their gym, one of the gyms, and went from there. It was taught on the Bob Jones and the Bob Zendo Kai system, freestyle. They had I suppose an offshoot of their club. Their clubs that focused on Muay Thai, that was they had links with Sitchatong Gym in Thailand, and it was a very basic system, but it was adequate, and it gave you a good understanding of your basic elbow strikes, knee strikes, which is what I needed, and my boxing skills weren't great because Kyokushin isn't really the boxing style. Just basic body punches, but so I had to brush up on my boxing skills, and then I had to learn or adapt rather my elbow striking and my knees. So the clinching with the knees, I suppose, was the major difference in the fact of, if I could speak more on broader terms, is when Muay Thai started to be exposed here in the very early shows with some of the Aussies, stepping in to fight Thai boxing. So they had done limited training. Some had, tried out different gyms and trained with different trainers, had different understandings of the correct way to grapple and clinch and knee. But geez, I think in the early stages, the grappling was almost the undoing of Thai boxing getting any sort of interest here from the from the spectators, because the clinching wasn't clean. It was really just standing wrestling, really. And you'd often hear the crowd saying, "What's hugging? Stop hugging him! Stop grabbing him! Fight clean!" They'd be booing the crowd every time the fighters got into a clinch. In the early shows, I've got to say, there'd be literally people that would just hate it, and because it wasn't executed well, and the knees, to get good knee strikes in, you've got to know your distancing.
Yeah.
So you're not just slapping the legs, you're drilling the knees into the body properly, and you're chambering your hips correctly and so forth. Well, none of that was really action back then. It was very, very raw and very rough and ready, and it wasn't really a great spectator sport. Mind you, for the fighters that were in there, taking part in the combat, but nevertheless, you're still getting kneed in all sorts of places you weren't used to. So, so that it wasn't the prettiest sport to watch back then,
right?
Because everyone was learning as they went.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. It doesn't matter how much you thought you knew. You never knew as much as the great exponents that were fighting in Thailand and executing things very dynamically. So, it was very clumsy in its early stages here, I have to say, which was hard to then get any sort of credibility. So if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I can expand a bit more on how the strategy I took to change that perspective, or to change that mindset with the media when we get around to it.
Yeah, for sure. And just in terms of time period, when was this?
I'd have to say, was it probably early 90s, late 80s, early 90s.
And you mainly fought at cruiserweight in the late 80s and early 90s?
Yeah, I was fighting around cruiserweight.
Yeah.
So that was my preferred weight. From memory, I started fighting really in the 90s, early 90s. The 80s, I was fighting predominantly the full contact karate, the bare knuckle karate. So that was the transition. It was around that time, was early 90s when I had that hand injury, and I had to fight with gloves because I wasn't allowed to fight without bare knuckle anymore. My hands were too busted up.
And were most of the fights Muay Thai mod rules, or you were sort of alluding to the grappling not being that smooth?
Yeah, there was so many rules, man. To be honest with you, going back to the late 80s, early 90s, there used to be above waist kickboxing rules. There was freestyle kung fu rules, which was basically a hybrid of kickboxing and kung fu. Then there was modified Thai, which was no elbows. Even the officials didn't really know how to handle a lot of the Thai boxing back in the day, So it was up to the promoter's discretion to promote something that they thought the crowd wanted to see and the fighters would undertake. So because there wasn't so many Thai boxing gyms, but there was a lot of kickboxing gyms, that's why kickboxing was as prominent as it was. The forerunners, Thai boxing in Australia, really came out of Perth, Western Australia, and Queensland. But the southern states, Sydney, or New South Wales, Victoria, Melbourne, Victoria, Sydney, New South Wales, really big kickboxing states. And it's only been, probably I don't know, maybe the last somewhat 15 years, I suppose, that they've become more prevalent. But before that, Queensland and Perth really ruled the nation with regards to having the best Thai boxing fights. And the southern states were predominantly kickboxing or K1. Then obviously with the resurgence of K1, the popularity and the big money of K1, and guys like San Greco and so forth fighting in K1, that's where fighters went. Let's face it, fighters are going to go, or combat sport athletes are going to go where the money's at.
Right.
Which is why there's a bit of a surge towards MMA now, because even fighting in the bigger organisations, you won't make big money fighting Muay Thai. Then you look at one championship, they have a host of different rules for different fighters. So it's not pure Muay Thai. They do MMA, they do small gloves, So
right.
the promoters pivot to where they think the audience is going to want to see, and then the fighters in turn will pivot to where the money's at, the money and the glory. So so back to your original question, the rules were a real mixed bag depending on the state and the show and what fighters were competing. But general rule of thumb is modified. Muay Thai rules is no elbows, just knees allowed, and kicks and punches, of course.
And then your own career, your accomplishments, you won a WKA belt, correct, at cruiserweight? You had a couple...
That's correct.
Yeah. What was that bout like? What sort of... Can you talk about your own career for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Look, as I said, I came through as basically a traditional karateka. Kyokushin is renowned for being the hardest karate style. And I think generally, to be honest with you, it's one of the hardest styles, of fighting of the traditional arts. Now, of course, with mixed martial arts, it's a whole new level. But back in the day, it was known when Masayama was alive, and the organisation, had millions of practitioners worldwide. It was a big organisation, and their style was very hard. So I competed in that purely because that's where I fell into. Then, as we mentioned earlier, with my injury, I had to evolve to look at different fighting on the advice of my doctor. So obviously, the transition, I was predominantly fighting and competing in kickboxing and boxing, and the kickboxing came fairly easily for me because I was one of my strongest weapons was my leg kick. So having fought kickboxing, then I obviously established a bit of a relationship with Stefan Fox from the World Muay Thai Council and the WMC camp there in Samui. We organised pretty much some of the first tours to the camp to train, and of which I took some people over, and it became an annual thing for me. I ran a heap of these tours. So I got to go over and train, pure Muay Thai, and I suppose started fighting here. Actually, I backtrack. I was already doing the Muay Thai through the Bob Jones Corporation here, which I had a basic understanding of. So I migrated through, from the BJC to my kickboxing, and then there was no real Muay Thai when I started. I'd already learned some basic grappling and learned some of the basics, but there was no events that were promoting Thai boxing in Melbourne when I was fighting. So I'd say I was one of the first guys here in Melbourne to actually start fighting Muay Thai in Melbourne back in the day, and then sort of fast forward, then started going over to Thailand at the WMC camp and training over there, and further working with the Thais over there. I was in the purest form, and sort of witnessing how the clink correctly. The little finer details that we really didn't know here. Then we started to bring back and implement it here. More and more people got interested in it. But there was always a battle with one and kickboxing because it was so big. So, as I said, that Muay Thai was there was an interest for it, but in the southern states, in certain parts of Australia, it didn't really generate much groundswell because everyone saw the fame and glory and money as being
important.
So it wasn't until the kickbox or the K1 organisation slowed down that Muay Thai then come to the fore. And in Queensland was always strong with Muay Thai. They didn't adapt kickboxing at all, and I think that was because some of the earlier guys that started Thai boxing in Australia were Queensland based. So there was a bit of we're Queenslanders, or we're tougher because we do Muay Thai and you guys do kickboxing. And the same with Perth, because guys like Pon Mardi over in Perth were promoting the big shows at the casino. I think it was Jim there in Perth. So again, the shows that were being done were big, They were glamorous, and that's where fighters gravitated to, because in those states, no one cared about kickboxing. There was no money. There was no big belt. Most were big on kickboxing, so that's where the fighters went to for opportunity. So yeah, I suppose the promotions dictated what was popular in the States back.
And just in terms of time again, when did you first start working with Stefan Fox and the WMC? When were you taking the trips out? And was Stefan based in Australia and then relocated to Thailand?
Yeah, Stefan had North Queensland Martial Arts supplied. He had a gym and like a supply company, which he was probably one of the first people to mail order actually back in the day, because it was still mail order, twins gloves, windy gloves. He was doing some of these more obscure brands that people only in the know would want. The Fairtex started back then it wasn't really that well known, so he was selling that through his store and promoting the shows up there in Mackay. So that's sort of how I got to know him. So through dealing with him on that level, then he moved to Thailand, and we still maintained our connection and worked together. And then, as I said, that's when the tours started, and we started traveling, annually over. And I think my first tour might have had, a dozen people, and then in the end, I would have had 40 or 50 plus going with me every time I did a tour. So it really grew. We'd fly into Bangkok. We'd train in Bangkok. We'd do some sightseeing, go to the Grand Palace, the river, go to the Wattle Run and stuff like that. Then we'd go to Samui and train, and then we'd organise a fight event in Samui, at the old stadium there in Chaweng. And then we'd go back to Bangkok and finish with our, I suppose, a bit more sightseeing and shopping. Yeah. But we trained a little bit in Bangkok at gyms like Eminent Air and so on, so on and so forth. So there were those gyms that we'd go to, and sort of training in Bangkok was always very good training in the islands as well. So it give you a really full rounded experience of how, I suppose, the rawness of the guys that train and fight in Bangkok as opposed to the guys on the islands.
And when was that you started the first trips over to WMC?
Yeah, probably about 95, 96 when we started to do the big tours. Yeah.
And then when did you start working with Blitz, which published International Kickboxer?
I started with Blitz in 1990, I believe. Yeah,
a long time ago.
There was only two of us, and all we had was Blitz, which was a quarterly newsprint magazine, and we grew that company to have a dozen monthly titles, everything from Blitz Martial Arts to Soccer International, Golf magazine, Triathlon magazine, Ironman bodybuilding magazine. So we developed quite a big stable of sports, health and fitness titles. But we started that basically just with one quarterly martial art magazine. And grew from there. And how Kickboxer came about was Blitz used to have a section called Ring Talk, which was basically all the kickboxing stories and Muay Thai. And it was such a popular part of the magazine that I suppose it spawned its own magazine. I did a reader survey, we did a market survey and analytics, and I suppose I suggested that we then branched that combat sport to have its own title. We did the same with Taekwondo, because Taekwondo was very big back then when it was emerging as an Olympic sport. So, and then another magazine that we in later years launched was obviously Inside MMA. So Blitz itself was a very holistic martial art magazine, but the readers somewhat dictated if other titles could have grown from it, depending on what the interest was. So definitely Muay Thai and kickboxing was huge, had huge popularity across the whole martial arts spectrum when we were putting that magazine out.
Yeah, I actually remember reading International Kickboxer in Oakland, California in like 2005 or 6. Really showed a lot of information about the Contender Asia and a lot of other things. I obviously didn't have much idea about what was going on, but now I distinctly recall a lot of people's names because of it. So can you talk a little bit about International Kickboxer as a magazine and what it was like? Obviously, having worked for a magazine, a lot of history of the sport.
Yeah, look, as I said, my idea to do the International Kickboxer magazine was because the interest was growing, and some of these fighters had real no forum for exposure, nor did the promoters to promote their events. So, we really, you've got to think back, and some of the younger listeners will find this mind-blowing, but there was no Instagram, there was no Facebook, there was no, this is sort of pre-internet hype, So the only way anyone would ever know of an athlete was, number one, if they were on TV, the mainstream media, radio, or magazine, or newspapers. So when you have a specialised magazine, we went about highlighting and profiling the main players of the industry. And of course, there was some, the question was often asked, what should I do to get exposure? And as a fighter, number one, you have to be entertaining, obviously. You've got to have a personality. You've got to have a story. And that's really, these are really the fighters that we grew, that become popular. So people wanted to read about them. I wanted to know more about them. I wanted to see photos of them. I used to do ringside photography myself as well. So I always knew that, the best shots are taken off the break. So as soon as the fighter's tangled, the referee steps back, you break it. One of the fighters is going to do something spectacular because they've got the room to do it.
Right.
So, capture good shots. And then when you see a fighter throwing a beautifully executed head kick, it's like then you highlight that in the magazine, and people would look at that and go, "Wow, look at this guy's skill." Who is he? So that's how it would grow.
And you had Rob Cox doing some correspondence for a while, correct?
Yeah. So Rob reached out. We were made aware of Rob. He was a Lumpini resident, all the time. So he'd send photos in and submissions, and it's a classic example of someone. If you want something, you've got to get off your ass and go and get it, So Rob, really introduced himself to us, would supply us with images, was happy to write and be our correspondent there. He didn't ask for a lot of money at the start. It wasn't like he was doing it for the dollar. He was doing it because he loved it, And this is a difference, I suppose, if I could be a little bit more critical of then and now. We fought. I mean, the most I ever got paid for a fight was $250. I fought in Thailand for a bottle of Mekong. That was my pay. Here's a bottle of scotch. So, but I loved it. It was my life. The challenge was for me to get in and test myself against whoever was there. There was no social media. It was, if someone took a picture of you, you were lucky. If you got in a magazine, you're a rock star.
Yeah.
So now it's, I think, the martial arts spirit and obviously in Thailand, people fight in Thailand to live. They don't fight for, there's no ego about it. They want to live. They want to feed their family.
Yeah.
That's why they fight. So the big question is, why do people fight? Why do people work for magazines back then? Why, what was the interest in the sport? From the trainers even, these trainers that weren't getting, didn't have hundreds of students. They were training in their garages. I started in my garage. Why? I did it for the pure love of wanting to train and be immersed in the martial arts. Not because there was any big payday, not because I was going to be a rock star, be the next Conor McGregor, and drive around in a Bentley. It's like if you wanted money back then, if you want money, you go and work.
Yeah,
and then
for sure.
And then you train after work because you love it. You don't train after work because you're going to be a millionaire.
Right.
I always trained after. I always worked 3 jobs. And I added my training to that. So, that's where the purity and the love for your martial art and for your combat sport is tested. These days, no disrespect, because everyone's got to have you got to have ambition and goals and all of that. But I think people start to train for the wrong reasons, and then they train for 1 or 2 years, and they don't, they have become mates, and they don't get $50,000 a fight, and they're like, well, why am I getting banged up for nothing?
Yeah.
I used to wear my bruises with pride,
right,
and get nothing for it.
Right.
It was like, who's tough? How tough can you be?
Right.
Don't tell me how tough you are. Show me how tough you are. Get in the ring and fight hard. That's where you prove your worth as a warrior.
Right.
So I think the mentality's changed a lot now. Society generally has changed a lot more now. But if I don't want to be that guy that's always talking about the old days. But I'm in both.
Right.
I've worked around the world in media, as you mentioned earlier. I commentated the Contender.
Yeah.
And that was live. For Mark Burnett Productions. There was millions and millions of viewers across the world.
Yeah.
So I've worked at the highest level of exposure in the sport to training out of my garage, and I've had every experience in my life. So people want to talk to me about martial arts and stuff. I suppose I come from a slightly different perspective. And guys like Rob Cox, if we go back, we got our Rob. He wrote for the magazine because he loved it. We were just trying to give Muay Thai the best exposure we could all around the world in whatever way we could.
Right. So I definitely want to touch on some of the commentating and Challenger, obviously, but let's look at the Kickboxer for a little bit. So what were some of the great moments for the magazine, and how do you think it sort of shaped how Muay Thai was viewed in Australia?
Oh, look, if I go back to our sales figures, the biggest sales figures that magazine had was when Contender Asia was on TV here on Fox 8, which is the cable TV network. We had all the fighters on the cover. The photos were professionally taken by the production company. It lended itself to be, a great topic of discussion for every fight fan. The head-to-heads, the elimination process, all of that. I mean, if you think about it, the Contender was really the first Ultimate Fighter series. The Ultimate Fighter is what grew the UFC on TV.
Yeah.
Well, the Contender really was a forerunner to that, and the Contender boxing was really, what people loved and what they tuned into, because of it's about the backstories. It's about aligning yourself with one of the fighters, and he's great. He's humble. He's a great fighter. And then you've got the cocky guy. You got the guys that are a little bit of smart asses,
like Zedov.
So you get the heroes and the villains, made up in these stories. That's what builds. You've got to build the story to promote anything. So if the big days was then. Then the likes of John Wayne Parr, of course. The young Aussie kid. That was making waves around the world. Then there was other guys, the Scott Bannons and the Nuggets, and there was a host of other guys like Sam Greco and Stan the Man, and from the kickboxing side, Sam Greco fighting in K1 was always big news too, against the likes of Ernesto Hoost and Peter Arts and Bob Saps and all these colourful characters. So what makes a good promotion? Building characters.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the events around the world now, what do people follow? A fight's a fight. Every weekend there's a fight event on TV almost now. UFC was massive when they had the heroes, when they had the Chuck Liddells and the GSPs. Now there's a show every day. There's a fighter. Some some you don't. Some are good, some are not. The one championship. We got lots of events, lots of fighters. Some some you don't. And I believe until there's some sort of a backstory and people are educated as to how these fighters come about, what's their daily challenges, what's their story, who are they fighting, who's their nemesis, that's really what will garnish interest from the public
Mm-hmm.
and create the stories. I mean, I'm the only fighter in this country ever to have his own TV show, which is Overtime TV.
Mm-hmm.
And I pitched that show to Fox Sports for 8 years before they said yes to it. And my whole agenda to that was just to paint stories on the fighters. You know, did a story with Kaylee Reese, who's obviously 10 times world champion, Kaylee. And one of the most marketable females in the sport in the world, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And everyone here loves her. Now she's a mom, living her own gym, and so on and so forth. But back then, she was a good-looking girl fighting full Thai rules and just hard, tough. So, telling her story, making and then putting her on Hammer Time and showing the backstories, showing that fighters are just not all Neanderthals that can't string a word together. Showing that these fighters are articulate, that they can command respect through the way they hold themselves and how they communicate to the public. That's really what my agenda on TV was. Yeah. These days it's sometimes things evolve a little bit, almost to WWE status. And it's good to see some of the fighters not being too abusive to each other and insulting each other so much, because it doesn't portray the sport in a light that the general public will want to be around. And that's, if you're in the sport, is the one thing that people don't understand. If you're in the sport, you know what it is. And you know that there's good people and there's bad people and this and that. But you have an overall understanding that the sport is good. It's a martial art. It's challenging physically and mentally, blah, blah, blah. We know that. Who doesn't know that? The people that we're trying to convince to watch it for the first time. Right. So if their first exposure to our sport or our martial art is two guys abusing each other's mothers and swearing and throwing bins at each other, what are they going to think about us? Right. I don't want my kids doing that. I don't want 90% of the world population don't care about Muay Thai or MMA or any of that. So you want that 90% to take an interest in it. How do you make them take an interest in it? You build a sport that has character, that has excitement, that has warriors, that has a backstory that engages people to want to know more. Like the golf, like the tennis, like the footy, soccer. I mean, look at the highest paid athletes in the world are not fighters, of sorts. When you look at the golfers and those per capita in a sport, there's a lot of professional athletes that make money, but the companies like Coca-Cola, and I myself have called companies like Pepsi and Coke and McDonald's to get sponsorship for events. And you know what? They all say the same thing. We don't want to be associated with a blood sport because it's not where we see our brand as being a good fit. So, we know in our sport that we're tough, we're good people, we're family men or family women. We love our families, we're loyal to our friends, and we've got all those good attributes. But if we don't portray ourselves right in the marketplace, then the mainstream I suppose advertisers and corporations won't align themselves with us, no matter what we say.
Definitely agree with that. So let's talk a little bit about your sort of time in commentating. You still commentate, and you sometimes commentate on Rebellion, correct?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So can you talk about how you got into that and how commentating has helped you sort of view the evolution of the sport in Australia?
Yeah, so again, it goes back to the start of cable TV here in Australia. I was approached. There was only mainstream TV, terrestrial TV. So cable TV started. There was a company called Galaxy that was the first, I suppose, branch of it. Then Fox Sports spawned from that. And someone that I knew approached me and said, look, these networks are coming to Australia. It'd be great if we could get, Muay Thai kickboxing on. So I approached the network head, went through acquisitions, spoke to him about popularity of martial arts, which is, martial arts in Australia is ranked in the top 10 sports, practitioner sports by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So, there's a lot of people that have some association with some martial arts. So I sold it that way to them. And I said, listen, and it comes back to, we went to the network and said, just send the camera to one of the shows. and I'll go with Michael Chiavello. At the time, Michael worked with me. I said, we'll commentate it for free. All you got to do is send a camera and have a look at what it is. And that was basically how it started. We went along, showed him how exciting the kickboxing was at the time. We had a very raw and I suppose slightly different commentary style. We were already doing it for videos when there were shows here. So the smaller promoters were doing shows here on the local scene, and they wanted to commentate it. So Michael started, and then I come on board. Michael was, I suppose, he was the host, and I was the expert, I suppose. I was the fighter, and Michael wasn't. So he knew. He could string words together well and build the hype, and I could explain what people were watching. And that was really, going back to the first shows. Again, I pitched to Fox Sports to do Hammer Fight Tips because it was an education process that I knew people would watch grappling and not know what the hell was going on.
Right.
So every show we'd do, 4 or 5 minute technique breakdown, and explain to the audience, this is clinching, this is what's dominant, this is what the fighters are trying to do, this is how one fighter will take the other one down. So we'd explain the intricacies and educate the viewer as to what they were watching, which then grew the audience, and then you had more people engaged with the broadcasts that we did over the years.
That's definitely a good idea. So, in terms of the amount of shows you've done and what promotions you've worked on, what has that been like?
Obviously, I have my own promotion, the Warriors Way events here in Melbourne, and I worked in conjunction with Lion Fight as well in the States, and I've taken my fighters over to fight on Lion Fight, and I've managed fighters that Ramesh Habib, who's Lion Fight world champion currently. So that side of it, I've worked on it. One of the most proudest things I've done with regards to promoting is through COVID, the Warriors Way Thailand Families fundraiser. We raised $28,000, which I'm distributing to Thailand now to various fight camps and organisations to help people through COVID. So the fact that I did a lockdown show here in my gym. I've got a pretty big gym, so we streamed it live. So if anyone's interested to see that, that's on the Warriors Way Facebook page. You can have a look, watch that full event. And what I did is I basically ran from the amateurs to the light, the kids, the light contact, the amateur fights to the full Thai rules fights. So we both basically showed the pathway of how the combat sports work here in Melbourne. I'm currently the president of the Victorian Amateur Martial Arts Association here in Victoria. So, we do the pad fights and I suppose the grounding fights for the fighters that want to go on to fight pro. So that was, I think, one of the, if I look back on all the shows I've done, and, we've done many titles and I've showcased many fighters and done elimination tournaments and all of that. But I think of recent times, I'm most proud of the fact that I can, we did a show and we did it as a fundraiser, and as people were watching the show, they were donating. The broadcast was free, and all I asked is for people that were enjoying watching it to donate something. It was good and bad. In some ways, I'm very happy I made the money, but I'm somewhat disappointed in some ways that there's a lot of people that run around talking about Thai boxing and having taken a lot from Thailand, that I weren't so forthcoming in being a part of it in some ways or donating. We've all been to Thailand. If you're serious about Muay Thai, you've either learned in some way from a Thai coach, or you've been to Thailand to one of the camps, you've trained alongside these people, you've taken from them. And my thing was, now it's time to give back. A little bit for us is a lot over there.
Yeah, for sure.
And some people really stepped up and were so generous, and others well, they sort of hit a bit,
Yeah.
for the sake of donating, and some of them are the ones that run around, with the Thai links, talk about their friends in Thailand, but they can, I would have hoped for a little bit more support, and that's a little bit of real talk there, for you. I think, there's too much rubbish spoken about sometimes, and when it comes down to it, you see who's real, and I think that was a good way of doing it. But I'm glad that we've made an exceptional amount of money, a lot more than I thought. And we're now able to direct over there to people in need.
So let's go back to the Challenger. Obviously, you mentioned it had a big impact on the landscape in Australia, and I would say worldwide. That's definitely how I got a lot of exposure to the sport. I remember seeing Soren Monkong at Boone like ages ago and being like, oh, wow. And then, seeing Narapon and Yatsen Klai on my first trip over, I was like, oh, these guys from the Contender Asia. Can you talk about like your part in it? And I know you commented and sort of a little bit more about how it impacted Australia.
I think it showed, for something to be popular, it has to be commercial in some aspects. And I think it commercialised it. Mark Burnett Productions, Mark Burnett, obviously, production company that does The Apprentice and Survivor and all these great TV reality shows. If they take a project on, they do it world class, And it made guys like Zidov and Yodsen Klai and Wayne Barr and, Jarbar and all that. It made them, known, household names in the fight game back then. Oh, that guy, or the Spanish guy, or, So, it was a real risk, I think, at the start with and the company called Omni Media out of Singapore, with the production company predominantly for it, because it was filmed in Singapore, obviously. Riaz Mehta was the he was the CEO of the company and the producer. And these guys invested, they got some funding, obviously, from the Singapore government, which, you really have to take your hat off to the Singaporean government, because, they really do fund a lot of stuff in the combat sports to this day. And that's unheard of, really, from a country, to do that. So, I thank them because I think they were, their backing of the show and the Mark Burnett Productions and everyone involved in it, and Stefan and the World Muay Thai Council, they had a huge impact on making Muay Thai become known. If I go back to one other aspect of strategy was, I spoke to Stefan about there's a lot of footage from Muay Thai from around the world that the WMC had. And I said, can you get me some of this footage? I can get it on TV as long as it doesn't cost anything, if that makes sense. Because the networks would not put any budget to it. But every network needs content. Right. So my negotiations with Fox Sports were, listen, I'll get footage that is broadcast quality, and there was footage coming from Europe, there was footage coming from Thailand, there was footage from all over the world that was facilitated or given to me, and that was, I say it again, this was given from the WMC were instrumental in this, and Stefan Fox, in getting me these master tapes that I ran weekly on Fox Sports, and we called it the Battleground events. So we give the series a name, we call it Battleground Series, and every week, at a certain time, you knew you would see Muay Thai on Fox Sports or on Fuel TV, which was a Fox Sports channel. And that was an extreme sport channel that had motocross and skateboarding and all the extreme sports on there. They also put it on that channel. That's an extreme sport. So what we did was, through the good graces of many promoters that allowed their footage to be released to the network without asking for money and via Thailand, we started to show Muay Thai weekly. Bang, bang, bang. It was on every week. And people had never seen it before saw some of the best fights. Because it wasn't a couple of guys that didn't know how to clinch, fighting in a bar. It was stadium fights, with A-class Thais fighting, tough Europeans and so on and so forth. So that really also created a bit of a groundswell here that popularised Muay Thai.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a number of things. If I look back, there was the magazine. There was literature that was in a newsagent, and the covers were always dynamic, and the fighters were profiled, and it was great photography. And there was Muay Thai from Thailand, and it was fight profiles of some of the greats like Ramon Decker and Rob Khan, and some of these greats. Then we did the Suckman Coles and other some of the great Thais. The story, the history of Muay Thai was explained in the magazine as well. So there was just a myriad of different mediums that were delivering Muay Thai subtly, but in a quality way.
Mm-hmm.
So that if someone was exposed to it, they're like, man, that's a tough sport. That's a pretty awesome sport. I want to know more. When's it on? How can I see more of it?
Yeah.
Who are these fighters? Where can I go? Then all of a sudden, a local show pops up. I'm going to go along and check it out. So it was like in all aspects of marketing, you have to have 3 or 4 touch points.
Right.
You've got to have repetition. You've got to have you've got to be relatable. You've got to engage your audience at different levels at different times, and we did that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm proud of being a part of what I think was the biggest time for Muay Thai here in Australia. It was to be honest with you, I don't know if it'll ever be that big again.
Mm-hmm. So moving from there, let's talk about your gym itself and the history of it. You had your sort of first location out of your garage in 1995, and then you actually opened an establishment in 2008?
That's correct, yeah. So 9th of November 2008, I opened a full-time facility. Mm. So this is when a lot of gyms, people were taken out of garages or school halls, or there was part-time facilities where you'd go and it'd be open from 4 p.m. until 8 p.m. And then there wouldn't be full time. But the having travelled to America I did a lot of travelling around the States. Full-time martial art facilities were becoming the norm. So people wanted a place where they could go, pretty much every day, not just 2 nights a week, and that that have good equipment, so on and so forth. So I set out. I rented about 500 square meters, a factory of 500 square meters, in a good position, pretty good position. I bought a full-size ring, brand new. Had bags, had the full-size ring, and had limited weights and cardio. Just enough for what fighters would need. And it grew, I grew from, I suppose 20 members to, up to 250 at the original location. And then I thought, I always analyse why people stop training with me or why they leave. Mm-hmm. And a big part of why people would leave was because they just wanted to go to a gym and do weights for a while. So, although I had like a treadmill and a couple of exercise bikes and a cross trainer and a few weights, I didn't have the full facility, Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I thought, well, I'm gonna go now. I'd established myself and it was going quite well, but it was time to level up. There was members that wanted to just do weights that maybe they didn't want to train Thai boxing or boxing anymore. So they just want to go do weights for a while. I thought, what, if I build a weights gym and I have a martial arts gym with it, it's a one-stop shop. Mm-hmm. So definitely, if you want to just go and do weights, I've got everything that you would need in the weights gym. I've got deadlifting stations, I've got Olympic weights, I've got cardio for days.
Right.
We've got treadmills, we've got cross trainers, we've got exercise bikes, we've got a spin studio, I've got a yoga studio, we do Pilates, we do pump. So I've got basically what any mainstream gym would have. Mm-hmm. And then I've got, the full-size boxing ring, we've got 30, 40 bags. I've got an MMA cage. I've got a jiu-jitsu area. I've got an MMA area. So it's really a one-stop shop for health and fitness and the combat sports here. And we've got a karate dojo attached to it as well. So,
Yeah.
which, Kyokushin Karate Dojo, which pays homage to, I suppose, where I started from.
And
so that's in the new location. So from garage to limited risk facility,
right.
knowing what my worst case scenario was that I had to operate on, to basically putting everything I own on the line and believing in what I was doing. If this centre didn't work here, I would pretty much have lost my life savings. So, I'm lucky that it paid off, but I still pretty much work every day till 11 p.m.
Yeah.
So I work hard to sustain it, and I love it, but it doesn't come easy.
Right.
And there's so much competition in the health and fitness arena now. I mean, over COVID, I've had 5 gyms open within 200 meters of my building. So
wow.
I've got about 30 gyms. So I've got over 30 gyms and fitness centers within 5 kilometers of my front door.
Yeah. So a lot of choice.
Definitely oversupply.
Yeah. So just sort of wrapping things up, I want to focus a little bit about your fight team and who you've developed. You mentioned Ramesh, who is a line fight champion. I'm, of course, familiar with River Daz, who regularly fights on Glory. What has your fight team been like, and how have they developed over the years?
Well, I've always had, great success with my fighters. I teach very systematically. There's some people that may or may not agree with grading systems in Muay Thai, but I've formulated my grading system, of which, there's levels that have to be attained, and before you can fight, you have to have a good proficiency and a good skill level. I've also established Muay Thai Systems International, which is a teaching system for Muay Thai that we're now, helping other gyms all around the world to integrate in their business. So the Muay Thai Systems International it's proving successful, not only for teaching and getting fighters, well skilled, but also for building, for people to build their business to the level that they want it to be, whatever that may be. I've had guys like Chris Harrington, who was 25 fights undefeated, also, national champion. I've had guys like David Bashnar. When I started teaching Muay Thai, and there was a lot of backyard heroes around, people that were fighting for titles here in Australia, that had never left their state or their neighbourhood pretty much. And for me, I said, my first 2 fighters ever didn't fight in Australia. They trained with me to a good level, and I said, we're going to go to Thailand and we're going to fight in Thailand, full Thai rules. Because I want to test my teaching, and I want to test my system, not against an ill-equipped opponent from another suburb. We're going to go to Thailand and we're going to try it over there. So we match the boys equally, because I'm not going to put them up against, someone with 200 fights.
Right.
But someone who's, of a good skill level, that will test their ability. And, both those boys won. And that was, if I got to say what's my proudest one of my proudest achievements, it's got to be that,
Right.
With River, River's trained with me from day one. Never trained with another trainer. He's got the Australian title in Muay Thai. He follows my system. He teaches right now. He's teaching the kids class. He trains in my classes. There's no difference in my gym. We're all the same here. My fighters have to do my classes alongside my other advanced members. So when they have a fight, then they do the class, and then we do our training after.
Right.
So there's no difference in class here. We all are the same. We all have to work together, because it doesn't matter if you're the best fighter in the world. You can't spar yourself. You have to have sparring partners. You have to have grappling partners. You have to have people that will help you in your fight team. So in order to maintain that, I always believe that every fighter has to be also a student, and every fighter has to also give back. And if they don't, then they don't fight.
Right.
Simple as that. It's not. I don't care if I'm standing in the corner with a fighter. There's a lot of trainers that will, they love to stand in the corner and be on TV, and that's their that's their ego trip.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care.
Right.
Absolutely, I'd rather not,
Mm-hmm.
because I have to leave my family. It costs me money to travel overseas. I've never taken a cent from any of my fighters, not a cent.
Yeah.
They keep their purse. In fact, it costs me money, because when we travel overseas and we stay longer, I pay for the hotel and I pay for the tourist stuff afterwards.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So, it's not about the money for me. It's not about the ego trip, because I've been on TV plenty, so I don't care to be on TV for 2 minutes in the corner yelling at a fighter. That's not my thing. There's people that's why they want their people to fight.
Yeah.
They want to stand in the ring and, be in front of a crowd. I've done it, been there, done that, and, so none of that phases me. What I want is that when we fight, we do well. We have 95% win ratio when we fight. We do well, and even if we don't win, that doesn't necessarily worry me, as long as my fighters fight with skill and heart and represent the style well.
Yeah.
Because you can't, that's all that matters to me. It's, I have a bit of a different skew on this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. I love the fighting game. When I was training, that's all I wanted to do, is just get in and fight. But then I go back to, why did I fight?
Mm-hmm.
I fought because I loved it, not for the glory, not for the money, not for the social media. There was none of that.
Right.
I fight in front of two people. I fight in front of nobody if it meant I could fight. I fought because it was what I loved to do, and it was the ultimate test of my skill.
Just wrapping things up, obviously you're a big figure in Australian Muay Thai history and the landscape now. Is there stuff that we didn't talk about that you think should be covered in this series?
Look, I think our biggest threat to Muay Thai in Australia right now is definitely MMA. I know for a fact on the networks that was the case, because the networks had given airtime and budget to Muay Thai and kickboxing, but the licensing agreements that the UFC have with the major networks pretty much exclude any other combat sport getting any airtime. So, now they put, UFC, you can get Muay Thai on UFC Fight Pass and stuff. So they've created a bit of a window for good events to be showcased. But our biggest challenge now is, number one, now that the fights aren't as prevalent, because Muay Thai has taken over that glory, I suppose, for the fighters.
Mm-hmm.
If Muay Thai is to grow, it has to have some system about it. It has to be a bit more unified. You've got sanctioning bodies fighting against each other. You've got belts of various descriptions. And I've had it said to me from the mainstream media, the reason we don't focus on your sport is because it's just too confusing. There's too many champions. There's too many sanctioning bodies. We don't know what's real and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't understand it, we can't cover it.
Yeah.
So the sport needs to be a lot more unified. The numbers need to grow, because you can have gyms with 2 or 3 people in them that are the best fighters in the world, but who cares?
Right.
My gym's got 1,500 members, and they all going to know about Muay Thai if I do a show. They're all going to know. They're going to, because they see it, they're immersed in it, they understand it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have to get the popularity around the pursuit that will then give it exposure. Things have to be popular before they can become popular, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So we need to be unified. We need to grow, and then the events. When you have gyms with 2,000 people and they're packed, and then you do an event. Look at CrossFit.
Right.
How did CrossFit get the CrossFit Games? Because they had all these gyms doing CrossFit first, and then they did the CrossFit Games, and everyone went on. And then it got on TV. Mm-hmm. So there's a classic example of a non-combat sport that is pretty much, in my mind, a little bit boring to watch, but it still gets more exposure than Muay Thai these days.
Right.
So there's got to be a bit more methodology to growing the industry, because it's a business, it's an industry, it's a martial art, it's a sport, it's all of those things.
Right.
So as such, we need to look at all of those things and go, well, how is a business successful? What makes a sport popular? What is true martial arts? and how do you maintain it as a true martial art? So it comes back to system. It comes back to promoting things credibly. It comes back to having credibility around what we do via not having 30 different champions in one weight division.
Right.
So this problem is not a new problem. This is something that's been around for years, and I think when the Contender and the big events were happening pre-UFC, we had opportunity there. But then people perhaps have become a bit fragmented, and now it's a harder job. It's definitely so much more harder.
Right.
Not only that, with social media, everyone's a hero now.
Yeah.
Some guy at home doing a spinning kick on the kick bag in his garage. He thinks he's the champion because he gets 200 likes on the photo. It's like spamming. Social media has been great for the sport, but it's also been bad as well in some ways.
Yeah.
Because it's become very convoluted. People that are on social media see all these people doing all these tricks and all these things, and there's trick martial arts, there's trick fighting, there's training drills, and as you know, there's guys that'll look like absolute beasts when they train, but punch them in the face once and they can fall over.
Right.
So then there's that can detract from the real warriors that are the really credentialed fighters that are out there struggling for that exposure.
Right.
Because it is so freely gained and given now on social media.
Thank you so much for your time, Mark. I'm really excited to explore more of the Australian Muay Thai history, and I really appreciate all that you've done for the sport. I've definitely, it's impacted me. I mentioned that I saw an international kickboxer back 12 years ago, and I appreciate all you've done for the sport.
No, thank you for your time and for taking interest in talking to me. I really appreciate it, and I hope that everyone that listened to this has enjoyed it and hopefully has a little bit of an education with regards to the whole lot.
So that was a great interview. I definitely learned a lot from it. I do think he was a little tangential at times, but definitely with some words of wisdom, things to incorporate, different perspectives, different time periods, different just outlooks on life was always very, very important. And again, Mark has a lot of experience in the game. He's been around for a long time, so I think he knows what he's talking about a lot of times. So thanks you, as always, for listening. This was the first in a series on Muay Thai history in Australia. So excited for further episodes. I think I will be interviewing Darren Reese next, or Kaylee Reese from Riddler's Gym out in Perth. So excited for that. And this has been On Fighting in Thailand, the best news and analysis covering the economics and infrastructure of Muay Thai. I'm Matt Lucas, journalist, commentator, and ex-Muay Thai fighter. Make stronger fighters, make stronger people.
This show was edited by Effie Ceruti. You can find me on Instagram at Effie_FC or on Facebook at Effie Ceruti.